agus bhfuil gur mágatóin as na focail cinálta sin, agus is mór nó nóir a bheith an seo nocht. Agus go an bhuichas leis an olah ruúhigín ón institút as an guide, agus le rí na gaeilge clois na trí nóide as a bháilte chuir se drona nocht. So there is a handout for the lecture, but you won't need the handout during the lecture. That is simply my references and all the bibliography. So everything you need for the lecture will be on the screen. Okay, so let me start by asking, what is a critic? So it's a person who judges, and the word critic is derived, in fact, from the Greek verb for to judge. Now, judgment is the starting point for thinking critically about literature. Now, audiences have always judged whether they think, whether they're enjoying a performance of a song or a poem, they think it's good or bad or indifferent. And I'm sure that's been the case always, ever since people have been making verbal art of any kind, and even, indeed, long before the invention of written literature. So, it's a simple enough question. Am I enjoying this song or this poem? But it leads eventually to the question, why am I enjoying it? And from there to the growth of an entire field of scholarship, literary analysis or criticism. Yet, nowadays, people often feel uncomfortable about the idea of passing value judgments. This makes people quite uncomfortable. Who has the social power to pass judgment? Who sets the criteria? These questions betray an underlying assumption that judgment rarely, if ever, remains on a purely aesthetic level. It has an incorrigible tendency to slide into moral and political judgment and become a means of social control, if that's not even what it was always. And this becomes very clear when we consider the professional praise poets of medieval Wales and Ireland. For once you start looking for judgment in our medieval sources, you find that it is simply everywhere. The job of the poet, indeed, was to pass judgment over others. There's a famous line in the Welsh Gododdin poem. Beirdd byd, barnant wir o galon. The poets of the world judge men by their hearts. As a neat summary of what praise poetry is supposed to do, I think that's quite hard to beat. But judgment was imposed on poets as well as by them. And to be a poet in medieval Wales or Ireland, you had to accept that you would be under constant scrutiny from your patrons, your audiences, fellow poets, from your master if you're not yet fully qualified, and outside observers, some of whom could be hostile. Anxiety about judgment pervades our medieval documents, and people worried about who got to do it and to whom, about when and where it was appropriate, and how it should be done. And the all-pervasiveness of judgment makes it, to my mind, a convenient gateway into a larger topic, and that is how medieval Welsh and Irish poets thought about their activity in general, their own literary theory, if you like. So, for a long time, historians of literary criticism or theory dismissed the Middle Ages as a barren period. So nothing much seemed to have happened between Horace in the Augustan age and at the very least Dante in the 13th century. In recent decades, that's changed completely, and there's been a massive growth in interest in medieval literary theory and criticism. And on the screen, you can see a small selection of some of the major works that have appeared. It's work that's gone in many different directions. For example, one area that people have looked at is the huge medieval tradition of glossing and commenting on authors. Another is the treatises on practical composition, the artes poetriae and artes dictaminis, and the roots of those in classical rhetoric. Now, those aspects then belong very much to the dominant Latin tradition, but literary theory in the vernacular languages has also come into its own in recent decades. one of the biggest issues here has been translation theory. Another is how authors carved out a space for their own particular language against the enormous prestige of Latin. The self-image of the vernacular author, and how a new vernacular audience could be willed or wished or called into being. A lot of this work has focused on prefaces, and very good examples are the work of Walter Hauck in Middle High German, and Jocelyn Wogan Brown, others on Middle English, and those are the two works you see there on the top line. Now, the Celtic literatures then have had a share in this growth of scholarship, and in fact, a very great deal of extremely valuable work has already been done in recent decades. And I wish to acknowledge the huge amount of material that is out there right here and now. Now, as Celticists, we are fortunate to have no shortage whatsoever of places to look for medieval literary theory. For example, we have a wealth of prescriptive texts, metrical tracts, or in Wales, the so-called gramadegau'r pencaerddiaid, the poetic grammars, of which more later. Another body of prescriptive material that has been explored in considerable depth in both countries is law, notably on what it says on the status and legal role of poets. Now, Ireland has much richer resources than Wales in certain areas, especially its huge body of narrative prose. And that's reflected in the rich Irish debate on how we should read Seanchas, given that it refuses to map on to our modern categories of history and fiction in any neat or simple way. And then the many extant multiple versions of sagas have made scholars interested in recension and rewriting studies, what's sometimes called by the French term réécriture. And the Irish were very unusual in medieval Europe because they glossed and commented on their vernacular texts. And the huge and formidable commentaries on texts such as the Aura Colmhile or the Failure Oingasa and so on are indeed a very special resource for finding out about literary thought. And then you can find explicit comment on poetry in texts by poets about other poets. So these sources would include debates between poets and praise poems, elegies, and satires on other poets. And again, more on this subject later on in the paper. But again, both countries have a good supply of this kind of material. Now, the sources we look to for literary theory, or theorizing indeed, they do not have to be explicit. Many are not explicit at all, which means that their implications have to be drawn out by ourselves. Translation techniques, for example. Not many medieval translators stop to tell us what they're actually doing. A few of them do, but most don't. Another example is the selection and ordering of texts in manuscripts. So this covers the presentation of texts. Do they have titles or not? Do they have authorial attributions or not? Subdivisions, layouts on the page, and compilation in general. Again, a huge growth area in recent years. But above all else, there's the biggest body of evidence we possess, and that's actual literary practice. So, in other words, the actual literature that survives. As to what kinds of literary thinking we can be looking for, well, again, there's too much to put on the slide. One really very big issue has been, and continues to be, a pan-European debate, indeed, on truth and falsehood, or history and fiction, in literature and in poetry in particular. And both Irish and Welsh texts have participated in that particular pan-European debate. Then we could think about our modern concept of literature itself. Does it have really anything useful to bring to the study of medieval verbal art? Or is it just too foreign a concept to be applicable? Authorship and canon, audience and reception, originality versus tradition. And then whether medieval people show an awareness of literary development over time. So, for example, do bardic poets in either country reveal a historical sense about their craft, or do they choose to present it as a permanently fixed cultural system? And so on. So I must stress that what I've put on this slide is not in the least degree exhaustive. It's just a few suggestions to give you some idea of what has been going on in the field and what could still be done in the future. Now, from here on in, I'm going to narrow my focus down as an illustration of how we can look for literary thinking in our medieval texts. I will focus on the particular concept of judgment and the practice of literary criticism. So we'll be looking then for instances when somebody offers explicit analysis or explicit evaluation of somebody else's text. I think this is a fairly under-discussed part of medieval Irish and Welsh literary cultures. But what made a medieval Welsh poem or a medieval Irish poem a good poem or a bad poem? What made it better than another poem? What was success in these poetic cultures, and what did failure look like? And who did the judging, and how was it done? Now, these are questions that it seems to me have attracted less attention than perhaps more intellectual frameworks, like, for example, the concept of Seanchas, or the whole nexus of issues that can be summed up as pagan past and Christian present. Good and bad, on the other hand, are difficult concepts to pin down. They may feel a bit less substantive, certainly subjective, maybe not quite intellectually respectable, or even slightly embarrassing concepts. At odds, then, with scholarly objectivity. But judgment is everywhere in our sources, and medieval commentators were definitely not shy about distinguishing good from bad. And judgment is to be found all over the place, including in some quite unexpected places. So here's one place which I came across while reading, not reading for the paper, but just reading in general. So in the medieval Irish manuscript, the Book of Iwana, there is a long poem, or set of poems, on world kingship. Basically 318 stanzas listing rulers from the Assyrian kings to the Roman emperors. Michael Clarke asks how we can possibly approach such a text as a piece of art. So I quote now, "It is hard to relate the names and calculations that fill these verses to any modern understanding of poetic form, still less of a literary aesthetic." Yet, Clarke then immediately goes on to say that it's clear that medieval Irish readers did so, because at the end of this poem, there are some additional stanzas added later on. And these stanzas name the author, Flann Manistruch, and they praise his poetic achievement. So I've put some of the phrases from these stanzas on the overhead for you. So they talk about the unique Flann, he counted the kings vociferously, keen sweet Flann, derived valid interpretation, the smooth scholar. He clarified, he made things straight, and finally, very clever is the deed, is morgelijk in modd. So I would draw your attention to the evaluative words here. They shouldn't just be read past as fillers or conventional puff, as it were. They are evidence of aesthetic sensibilities. They're evidence of what people actually went to poetry for, when they went to poetry looking for. Now, this is a poem that today I suspect most of us might struggle to get through from end to end. But this medieval reader, at least, found it to be aesthetically pleasing. He found it to be a good piece of work that fulfilled whatever generic expectations he brought to reading it. Now, for the rest of my time tonight, then, I think I'll escape to more easier pastures, where we have more explicit and straightforward examples of critics and criticism. And I'm going to focus on Welsh bardic poetry, the area where I feel best qualified to comment, but I very much hope that the questions I raise will be relevant to Irish material as well. So let me move then to a passage where we find actual explicit comment on how important judgment or criticism is in the Welsh bardic tradition. So this is a passage taken from one of the bardic grammars. And this particular grammar, so really the grammars are textbooks of poetry. And this particular one dates from around 1330, and it's the one that's in National Library of Wales, Penniath 20. So the grammarian here is addressing the kind of high-status poet who in Welsh is called a prydydd, so roughly speaking, a fully qualified bardic poet. He's very keen to separate such artists from the disreputable lower orders among the professional entertainers. These he personifies in the figure of the clerwr, so very roughly, a wandering rhymer. Let me start to read this now. Ni pherthyn a brydydd ymyrru ar glerwriaeth arfer ohonau canis gwrthwyneb yw ei crefftau. So it is not appropriate for the prydydd to engage in clerwriaeth in order to practice it, for their crafts are opposite. It's a very forthright statement, and the grammarian now goes on to explain why he thinks the prydydd and the clerwr are so opposed. Canis crefft prydydd yw canmol a chlodfori a digryfhau a gwneithir moliant a gogoniant a diddanwch a dosparthus yw ei gerd a barnu a ellir arnei. So the craft of the prydydd is praising and exalting and entertaining and making praise and glory and pleasure, and his poetry is analysable and can be judged. So now you see where my title tonight came from. His poetry is analysable and can be judged. Contrast this finally with the clerwr. Chrefft y clerwr croesan yw anghanmal ag anghlodfori ag ogani a gwneithir cywilydd a meddwl ag anghlod a chresangerdd anosbarthus yw heb allal barnu arnau canis am boi'r gerdd fudur yw. So the craft of the scurrilous clerwr is dispraising and denigrating and satirizing and causing shame and disgrace and a bad reputation, and it is unanalysable, scurrilous poetry that cannot be judged, for it is dirty poetry, filled with spit. So the essence of the high-class poetry of the prydydd, then, is that this key concept, it is Dosparthus. So what that means is it's capable of being analysed. It can be broken down into its constituent parts and subdivisions like other respectable medieval arts. Okay? It's maybe not even too much of a stretch to translate Dosparthus as rules-based, though I preferred analysable in my translation, and Michaela Jacks, in her recent published translation, has chosen classifiable. Now, all these are defensible translations. Whichever you choose, however, the idea is that this poetry is based on rules, and so one can pass judgment over it because there are clear criteria for doing so. In contrast, the work of the clerwr has no rules. It's chaotic, it's irrational, and cannot be analysed, only condemned. Now, there are many kinds of court entertainers in medieval Wales, and Ireland for that matter, besides the high-status poets. So there are many kinds of lesser poets, musicians, jugglers, acrobats, dancers, buffoons. The high-class poets were very, very clear. There was a pecking order here, and they were at the top. It is, of course, not true that popular poetry had no rules, or was chaotic, or didn't require any training. Okay? None of that was true, I'm sure. Popular art forms very definitely have their own rules, which can be extremely firm. But it suited the high-status poets to insist that only their art was based on learning and regularity, and was worth the attention of a critic. Now, this was also a response to a second kind of challenge from a different direction, for there were always hardline religious commentators around who rejected all poetry in any language that was not directed towards God. Now, one of the most famous of all medieval Welsh poems is a devastating attack on Welsh praise poetry by Sean Kent, composed around 1400. Okay? So, Sean Kent says, there are two kinds of inspiration, he says. Okay? One of them comes from heaven and it was received by the Old Testament prophets. The other one, the other awen then, comes from hell, and that's the one the Welsh poets got. Okay? Awen yw hon, wan ei hawl, o ffwrn natur infernal. So this is an inspiration, weak as its claim, from the furnace of infernal nature. And that explains why Welsh poets lie all the time. Hwyri bod gwyn teuluaidd a medd, lle nid oedd ond maidd. Okay? So they claimed that they had courtly wine and mead, where in fact there's nothing but whey. And the rest of the poem is a similar vein, it's a similar collection of poetic lies, and I warmly recommend you reading it. Now, this is a discourse that should be familiar from Ireland, where it was similarly applied to the Irish bardic poets by those who didn't like them. A good example was published in the Zeitschrift very recently, and I've put just one stanza from this poem on the overhead for you. So, Cyrthi urla, cruthach caev, ar erdan whale, mór an oil, comthi der chrichúliach cham, gymir rosk mal, mar anglin. So you set beautiful, shapely hair on a bald brow. Great the reproach. You compose for the crooked, trembling-eyed man, that his steady eye is like glass. Now, by insisting on rules, order, and discernment, the bardic poet could be presented as an upholder of the divine order. Indeed, praise poetry embodies the order, the divine order in words, unlike the subversive cleror, who represents disorder and chaos. And compare then in Irish the very well-known defense of poetry, Reachtúil on roiv, where it is argued that praise of people, who are created by God, is ultimately praise of the Creator. So mollad duine is do is mollad, and Léacht doni a gruthachad. And very similar arguments we found in the Welsh corpus as well. Now, condemnation of poetry from outside the mainstream of the bardic profession was no doubt a threat, but it's difficult to evaluate really how much of a threat and how much of a continuous threat it was. Perhaps it was only an occasional problem until changed social circumstances and political circumstances in the late 16th and early 17th centuries fatally undermined the bardic profession in both countries. Until that time, though, a much greater concern would have been being judged within the bardic sphere by other people who broadly agreed on the principles and had no moral objection to praise poetry. And Welsh bardic grammars provide us with considerable information about how this kind of criticism worked. So we'll begin with a very obviously relevant section in the bardic grammars on faults. So faults are referred to as the beiau ar camau a ddyllir gochel, the faults and errors that should be avoided. The grammarian then goes on to explain the aspects of poetry with which you can find fault. His verb here is beiau, to criticize or find fault. So you can find fault with metrical requirements like rhymes, and with non-metrical issues. And here he lists ystyr, synwyr, and dychymyg. Now, ystyr and synwyr are very approximate synonyms in the sense, meaning or sense. Dychymyg, though, is a key word in medieval Welsh poetic thinking. Now, in today's Welsh, dychymyg means imagination. And there's certainly something of that in medieval usage of the word here as well. But in fact, I think a closer rendering is with the Latin rhetorical term inventio. Now, inventio is coming up with your stuff before you start writing. And it covers both the concept of finding things, i.e. existing material, and devising. So unlike our modern derivative invention, it covers both the collection of existing materials and coming up with your own. So it's a basic part of rhetorical doctrine that you first you get together what you want to say, and only afterwards do you clothe it in inappropriate words. So this makes a very sharp distinction between content and form, and that's pervasive in classical rhetorical thinking, and it continues to be pervasive in medieval thinking about verbal composition as well. But the key issue here then is that faults can be found not only in the mechanical spheres, such as rhymes, where it's easy to tell what's right and wrong. Either the words rhyme or they don't. But also in intangible aspects. Okay? Not surprisingly, though, the grammarians found it difficult, or they found it easier to demonstrate what a metrical fault looked like, whereas faults in meaning and matter they found much harder to describe. So you feel the grammarians knew what they wanted, but they struggled to put this into words. So they tell us that a poem needs to have enaid, meaning soul, and dychymyg meddwl digrif, so invention of entertaining thought or matter. But when they try to explain what they mean by a lack of soul, it's interesting that they reach for a concrete, definable problem, and that is not having a verb. Okay? So the verb then in this definition becomes the enaid, the soul, and it becomes the ystir and the sunwe, the sense. Okay? Now the absence of a verb is something you can measure easily, but I think it's very clear from the total context of these remarks and the usage of these terms in more widely in medieval Welsh literature that enaid, sunwe, and ystir means something much richer than that. They are bound up with the dychymyg, the inventio, that grammarians talk of here. Now, on other occasions, though, the grammarians do show themselves capable of rising above a mechanistic rule. So one rule they have is that you are not allowed to repeat yourself in a stanza, not allowed to have the same word twice, okay? Unless, oni bydd hatgyllaeth neu ysmalhawch cariad an SCS drosto. So what this seems to mean is that you could repeat yourself if you wanted to express strong emotion, hatgyllaeth, say in an elegy, or if you wanted to express the insistence of your love in a love poem, so ysmalhawch cariad. So, here we see judgment then straying into very subjective areas indeed. It's all very well to have a mechanical rule saying you can't repeat yourself, but repetition is an important rhetorical and poetical tool, and it can't just be thrown away. So the grammarians then were bothered, they were clearly bothered by the subjectivity of judgment, and you can see this in the second passage on the overhead. It is not a fault in an englyn, a stanza, if somebody else has composed a better englyn. Rather, if the englyn is free of the legal faults listed above and has soul and meaning and invention in it, let it be judged good, even if another englyn is judged better and a third best of all. In other words, it was compulsory to judge a poem to be good if it fulfilled the basic minimum criteria for being good. You were not allowed to condemn a poem just because it wasn't brilliant. But the fact that they're having to say this suggests that people were doing just that, condemning poems that they just didn't think were as good as other poems, even if they met the minimum requirements. Okay, we'll move on next to another section in the grammars. At the end of the grammar is a section called trioedd cerdd, or triads of poetry, sometimes triads of song. This section contains much of interest for us. And the triads are extremely interested in the impact of poetry on the audience. And judgment, you find judgment then is really a major theme running through this section of the grammar. Performance. Performance was a source of anxiety because a good performance could really affect the judgments made about a poem, and so could a bad one. So 3 things make a poem and expression elegant: fluency of speech, elegance of sense, and the natural intelligence of the reciter. And 3 things ruin the elegance of a poem and expression: a dull-witted reciter, inelegant sense, and thoughtless error by the speaker. Now, it must often have been the case that poets had no control over these problems, because their poems were often recited not by them, but by professional reciters, or datgeiniad. If a datgeiniad was performing, then it's perhaps unlikely that the author was even present. So we suspect this was different from the Irish system of having a rachera perform alongside the author. The datgeiniad, by contrast, seems to have operated away from the poet, in context where the poet was not himself performing, and therefore away from where an eye could be kept on his activities. But these are not the only problems of performance. A poem could also be recited at an inopportune moment, when the patron had not given his permission. And it can also be recited to the wrong person. It's very hard to see how that could happen, really, unless, again, it refers to datganiaid taking a poem without permission and recycling it for another patron. Thirdly, and most interestingly, though, for us, is the phrase "Isha barnor a wipaig ddarni yn gyfiawn," so lack of a judge able to judge correctly. Does this mean that a poem's honour was compromised by the mere absence of a qualified person from the performance who could judge it? If so, who was qualified to be the barnor? Would a well-informed patron be enough? Or did other poets need to be there to give approbation or disapprobation? The version of the same triad in the Red Book copy of the triads, this is here now, has a slightly different wording. So, isha cerddwyr I barnu, lack of poets to judge it. So that suggests that it was vital for actual poets to be present in order to assure a poem's reputation. Now, the context of this triad is not clear enough to tell us whether the kind of judgment we're looking at here is a formal process or informal whisperings among the audience. It's not clear enough to tell us whether all performances were judged formally, perhaps that's maybe unlikely, or whether the grammarian is thinking of examination of an apprentice by a master. But if so, the grammarian is not saying that clearly in the triad. Such examinations, though, would have been a vital part of poetic education, and we, in fact, have a considerable amount of evidence for the equivalent processes in Ireland. Now, the requirement to judge could place a considerable burden on a poet. Another triad insists that a poet is required to make his judgment public. He isn't allowed to maintain a diplomatic silence. So 3 things that a poet should not conceal: harmless truth, judgment on poetic artistry, and praise for good people. Conversely, it was unprofessional to allow personal bias to skew one's judgment. So 3 things that are forbidden to a poet: faulty judgment of poetic artistry, satire that is not deserved, and scurrilous poetry. Okay, so much for what the triads have to say about judgment as a process. Let's look now at what they have to say about good and bad, the criteria of judgment. So the 3 things that cause a poem to be popular or praised, so hoffant gerd. The first is depth of meaning, dyfnder sonor ystyr. The second is unique invention, or didawg ddychymig. And the third is the poet's own reputation. Obviously, unlike the other 2, that's not an internal criterion within the text. In the matching negative triad, we find shallowness of sense and meaning and well-worn invention as problems. So conventional material, then, not good enough. So what we see here, then, is at least some appreciation of originality as a virtue. The poet's matter, his dychymig, should be or didawg, which means unusual, unique, or unexpected, and as opposed to sathredig, which means well-trodden or following the usual beaten path. You wonder really what this could have meant in relation to praise poetry, where the freedom of the poet was fairly constricted by the genre. Nevertheless, we should note clearly the requirement here, the expectation here for originality. Other triads are even more demanding. So the poet is supposed to have amlder Cymraeg, richness of Welsh, presumably a large store of words and expressions to enrich his poetry. Then he must also have a good knowledge of hengerdd, a barddoniaeth, ag ystoria. Now, hengerdd means older poetry, so that of previous generations before the poet, and ystoria means stories, histories. The third member of this triad is barddoniaeth, is not so clear, as the word seems to mean simply poetry, but I take it to mean contemporary poetry, as opposed to gerd, therefore. So the works of the poet's own contemporaries. And there's some support for that in a differently worded but similar triad, which is at the bottom of the screen here, where we see in the place of this, in the place of barddoniaeth, we see dychmygfa'r gyreindeb prydyddion newydd profedig cymeradwy. So the inventive elegance of new acclaimed tested poets. So, as is often the case in literary criticism, the terms used are metaphors drawn from evaluation in the physical world. Depth of meaning, richness of Welsh. And they're phrases we wouldn't be too surprised to see in a contemporary book review. They are, of course, highly subjective qualities, and we note that poets could not simply rely on formal correctness to get them through. So our poets walk a tightrope then, and falling off must have been a constant fear, at least if you believe the bardic grammars. Okay? You could end up publicly shamed, denied your rightful honour, refused your gift from the patron, mocked by other poets. The triads and indeed the rest of the grammar portray poetry as an anxious business. Maybe that's a feature of the genre, rather than a fair impression of the totality of the life of a medieval professional poet. I suspect they had a lot more fun than that in reality. But it's a feature of didactic texts that they focus on right and wrong, and on the consequences of getting it wrong. So before we leave the bardic grammars, let's just remind ourselves that, in the words of the 16th century poet and grammarian, Simon Tvechan, Cans niwnaid cerdd, ond myluster glist, agor glist galon. For poetry was not made except for sweetness for the ear, and from the ear to the heart. So I offer that quotation just to temper the impression that I've been giving of the bardic grammars as these rigorous and ferocious documents. Okay, it is now time to move from the theory of criticism to the practice. And now we're going to find a wealth of material in the corpus of late medieval bardic poetry. And the two richest categories are elegies composed for poets and debates between poets, which are known as ymryson in Welsh. And they continue to the present day. Now, these categories will occupy the rest of my talk tonight, and because there is so much I could talk about here, I'm going to have to be extremely selective. In fact, we're going to get through only 2 bardic debates, and that in a very superficial manner. So, the most famous Welsh bardic debate of all is between Gruffydd Grieg, on the one side, and Dafydd ap Gwilym on the other side. Gruffydd Grieg and Dafydd ap Gwilym are both poets who composed a great deal of imaginative love poetry, drawing on themes and images of courtly love, which are widespread in medieval European literatures. They lived in the early to middle 14th century. They were contemporaries, and probably men of much the same age and close associates, as far as we can tell from their poetry, that is. Now, the ymryson, the bardic debate between these 2 men, was started by a poem by Gruffydd Grieg. And in this poem, Gruffydd picked up on an image that Dafydd used a lot. It is the spears of love, or gwewir serch, all these spears that pierce his body and cause him enormous pain. Gruffydd's move, his clever maneuver in this poem, the key to the humour of this poem, is that he pretends this metaphor is totally serious and takes it completely literally. Okay? Trian mor glaf yw Dafydd, trwyddo serch, trwyddo a sydd. It's terrible how sick Dafydd is. There's an auger of love stuck right through him. It's amazing he's still alive. Eres yw fyw efo, says Gruffydd, with all these spears sticking into him. And he's been telling us all about them for the past 10 years. 10 whole years. I'm afraid to say there can be only one possible conclusion, says Gruffydd. Mawr o gelwydd, brydydd brad, y drithodd Dafydd drithiad. It's a big lie, the untrustworthy poet, what Dafydd the flatterer has declared. It just can't be true. Not even Arthur could survive these injuries. The truth is that Dafydd is a bit of a weakling. He's always moaning about his love pains, and a good strong man from a different part of Wales, and I think we mean Griffith Grieg and Anglesey, could defeat him with a reed, let alone a spear, if, that is, Dafydd did not die of lovesickness before Griffith could get to grips with him. So, it's a very clever little poem, a very funny poem, but it gives us an interesting evidence for the individual poetic voice in 14th century Wales. A particular poet could become known for using a favourite image, indeed overusing a favourite image, and can be teased about it by another poet who had noticed the habit. Now, what Griffith does is he presents his critique in a very po-faced and serious manner, okay? As if he's passing a genuine, serious moral judgment on Dafydd ap Gwilym. He examines Dafydd's truthfulness and finds him to be a liar. And here Griffith picks up the kind of language that was used by moral commentators on poetry, and we talked about a bit earlier on in the paper. Dafydd then is letting the side down. He's letting down the professional poets by admitting an outright lie into his verse. So what starts as literary criticism then veers into moral condemnation. Now, throughout the 20th century, this piece of what I would describe as male professional banter was read entirely seriously as a real judgment. And commentators argued that Griffith Grieg was attacking the whole apparatus and repertoire of courtly love and all its themes as untrue, lying, therefore, exaggerations that were not fitting to be used in Welsh poetry. And this allowed the Ymryson to be interpreted as a mighty, weighty, heavy intellectual debate on the rightness or wrongness of composing light-hearted, courtly love poetry, as opposed to traditional Welsh, serious-minded bardic poetry for men. In 2010, I published a review of the Ymryson, in which I quite seriously disagree with this interpretation. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that again tonight, but my reasons were partly just rethinking the actual literal meaning of many lines in Griffith's poem and Dafydd's poems, but also it just makes Griffith Grieg into an idiot. You know? Griffith Grieg wrote exactly the same kind of poetry as Dafydd ap Gwilym. He's a wonderful, clever, inventive, metaphorical love poet. So the idea he can stand there and just represent some stick in the mud, praise only, we're not allowed to talk about women. It's not a tenable view of Griffith Grieg. We discover what the Ymryson is actually about then, I think, by regarding or discussing Dafydd ap Gwilym's response. And the theme that appears there is judgment, rights and wrongs thereof, and the danger of having your poetic individuality judged when you don't have control over the reception of your work. So Dafydd starts with some fairly juicy medieval abuse. Griffith Grieg, empty inspiration, trembling face, because Griffith Grieg had a speech impediment. Cynnydd cerdd bydd o unfloedd, so all the achievement in poetry of a one-year-old girl, and goes on from there. But he then settles to a more serious argument, and that's what I've put on the screen for you. So, his argument then is a complaint about his intellectual property being taken. Un ai cas, arall ai can, enw gwrthgas, un ai gwrthgan. So one person may compose or come up with a poem, but then a second person can perform it, arall ai can. And then comes the third member of the triangle, un ai gwrthgan, the imitator. And that is how I take the verb gwrthganu, to sing against. Okay? So I don't take it in the sense of oppose or express opposition to. I take it in the sense of imitate. And that should become clearer from a later quotation I'll offer. But as I say, I don't want to go into the technicalities of interpretation tonight. But the effect then of the loss of control is that Dafydd's poetry has come to seem monotonous, harping on the same boring themes all the time as Gruffydd Gryg had complained. But it's not Dafydd's fault, okay? His poem is like a harp that's played badly by a vagrant in an alehouse until everybody hates the sound. Everybody's sick of the noise, Only cas. It's not the harp's fault, but the harp gets the blame, okay? Judgment is out of the control of the true maker when the poem is performed beyond his purview. And that reminds us of the points made in the triads of poetry. Inappropriate performance or a bad performer can ruin the reception of a good poem. And of these circumstances the poet cannot control, the most insidious is the stealing of his material by other poets. And now he turns on Gruffydd Gryg, the worst offender of all. If Dafydd's poetry has come to seem a bit stale and predictable, well, that's the fault of plagiarism by second-raters like Gruffydd. So, no poet sings to any woman as fair as sunlight, a poem with his 10 nails, that refers to accompaniment with the harp, therefore, without Gruffydd, sad proof, grumbling face, singing a copy of it. There are many more would-be carpenters in the world than there's good building timber, says Dafydd. And in one of the most famous couplets in all of Dafydd's poetry, Omin gwawd, orddawd erddof, aidir coed, I dorri cof. So if he wants a poem, noble, strong blow, let him go to the woods to cut down thought. So if Gruffydd wants to compose poetry, he should go out into the woods and cut his own timber down. But Dafydd substitutes for a word for timber the word cof, which means thought, what's in your thought, what's in your mind, and then by extension, the material or subject of a literary composition or poem. The metaphorics of these wonderful lines have been brilliantly surveyed by Morgan Thomas Davies, and Davies traces the comparison between poetic material and wood or timber back to classical times. It is, of course, an extremely widespread metaphor. But again, we're reminded of the triads of poetry and their emphasis on the need for original invention. Gruffydd here is judged to fail the test. He just rummages through other people's wood piles. To return to the rhetorical theory that I said underlies the concept of dychymyg in the grammars, in the triads, that is, Gruffydd may be able to put his own words on things, but the invention underneath is all Dafydd's. Not only was Gruffydd wrong to judge Dafydd's work by unfair criteria, but he'd no business judging at all. Okay? We have judged it to be bilious and hateful to criticize a poem where there's no fault. Okay? Notice the use of the same terms as we saw in the bardic grammar. So beyaw, to find fault, and calm, one of the words for poetic fault. So the point made here then is that Gruffydd Gryg has failed to criticize by an accepted criterion of what's right and wrong in poetry. Nor was Dafydd expecting the judgment. He wasn't ready for the judgment. It came out of nowhere, and it was unfair. Now, Gruffydd Gryg comes back strongly then in his second poem against all of this, and he demands to be tested to show that Dafydd's accusation about plagiarism is not true. So, a phrofer pan fy nerfi, test me whenever you like. This verb profi, to test, occurs elsewhere in similar contexts, and I think it's the technical term for examining an apprentice poet, the examination of an apprentice poet by his master in order to confer a poetic rank. So what Gruffydd demands here is a properly regulated process of poetic judgment to be carried out on his work, not the unregulated assault that he's just received from Dafydd. For Gruffydd also criticizes Dafydd for judging inappropriately. Ceisiodd fi, he went for me. Okay? Heb rybydd, without warning. So the pose Gruffydd adopts in these lines is that it was he who was attacked, without due process by Dafydd. He ignores the role of his own first poem in starting the row, as if then he never intended that poem to be a serious judgment against Dafydd, just a piece of leg pulling. And that allows him to treat Dafydd's response, therefore, as if you like the first poem in the Ymryson, and itself an unexpected but in this case, extremely serious and seriously meant judgment against him. Now, scholars have made the very legitimate point, and it's well worth reminding ourselves that we cannot know at this distance in space and time the feelings of medieval people. Okay? Can't know whether authors of Amrasonai mean what they say, or whether they are really engaging in a social ritual simply to entertain their audience. Okay? And by the end of this Amrason, Dafydd Gwilym is repeatedly attacking Gruffydd Grieg's speech impediment, and both poets are fantasizing about sleeping with each other's mothers. So it is very much all downhill from the section I've shown you. But we can't really know if Dafydd Gwilym was furious about Gruffydd Grieg's first poem. We can't really know if Gruffydd Grieg was genuinely shocked by the response he got. Okay? But we can say that's what the authorial voices are saying. Okay? That's what they're actually saying in the poems. Those are the poses of the two protagonists in their poems. The authorial voices then act out the view that this Amrason did not follow any customary accepted rules of poetic judgment. It started out and got worse and worse and worse because each poet felt that the other had broken the rules. Okay, my second and final example will be the Amrason. It's about 60 to 80 years later, so in the early 15th century now. We've got an Amrason between Rhysgoch Eryri, up there in the north, and Llywelyn ab Amwyl in the middle of the country, in the area known as Powys. Now this Amrason began because of the death of a third poet, Gruffydd Llwyd. Okay? Now Gruffydd Llwyd was a very, very fine love poet, very much in the same tradition as the later generation after Dafydd Gwilym and Gruffydd Grieg, but very much in their tradition, and a very, very fine poet. He was also a native of Powys, like Llywelyn ab Amwyl. Now, when Gruffydd Llwyd died, he was the subject of an elegy by Rhysgoch Eryri. And Rhysgoch frames his elegy as an act of judgment, professional judgment, on Gruffydd Llwyd. So, per profiad gwaith, and gwawd pawb, if you tested the work or the poetry of everybody, you wouldn't find a master alive to match him. So Gruffydd then was an athro, an acknowledged teacher or master of bardic poetry. But Rhysgoch insists also on his own unique qualifications to judge the work of Gruffydd Llwyd. In the second quote, so Rhysgoch is unhappy, is Aflawyn more unhappy than anybody else, because he, because nobody in Powys, that is, knew Gruffydd Llwyd's work as well as he did. Okay? Am nad adweiniad o Powys neb iawn fel ei hadweinon. Now, we don't know for sure what made Rhys so confident that he knew Gruffydd Llwyd's poetry better than anyone in Gruffydd Llwyd's own region. He does, though, go on to describe himself as a contemporary of Gruffydd, and it would seem that they've been friends for some decades. Nevertheless, the comment could be taken as a slight against Powys, and not surprisingly, it was. And a much younger man, Llywelyn ab Amwyl, took up the challenge, and so what began as an elegy for a poet in an older generation turned into an angry confrontation between youth and experience. So Llywelyn responds by writing another elegy for Gruffydd Llwyd. Okay? And he says this: Hawdd oedd I fab adnafod ar gywydd newydd I nod. So it's easy for someone to recognize his mark on a new poem. It's a metaphor drawn from carpentry. So carpenters might mark the timbers of a house they built with unique marks, a sign of their pride in their craftsmanship. It's a real image, therefore, for the poetic individuality of Gruffydd Llwyd. His poetry is so unique that a new poem by him was instantly recognizable as his. So not only could his quality be judged, but his individual voice could be recognized. And he fulfilled all the demands we saw in the bardic grammars. So he produced mesur, glân a cynghannedd, so he's technically perfect in meter and cynghannedd, but he also gave synwyr wew, worthy, worthwhile sense. So not only metrical perfection, but excellent content. Now Llywelyn explicitly turns to the theme of judgment and asks, who could possibly take the place of Gruffydd Llwyd? Pwy ar ôl hwn? Perwyl hardd, profed ag ei dwlle prifardd. So yet again, so the poet then who would take Gruffydd's place is going to have to stand the test, profed. And again, it's that verb profi. But Llywelyn is in fact afraid that Powys is not going to be ready to accept another Gruffydd Llwyd. Okay? Perygl yw na bydd parod Powys dir am y sgwir gwawd. So Powys will not be ready for a carpenter's square of poetry. Now, the carpenter's square is, and still is a tool used by carpenters to measure and make sure that timbers are laid level. Gruffydd Llwyd then was a tool for checking the correctness of poetry. Llywelyn, who is still a young man, and perhaps still an apprentice, feels that he needs someone to check his work. And so at the end of his poem, he turns to another living poet and asks that more senior poet to just run an eye over his elegy for Gruffydd Llwyd and just make sure it's good enough. Okay? So if you see anything crooked about it, he said, just put your mark on it. So Llywelyn then achieves a nice mixture of professional self-confidence and modesty in the same poem. But he's no deference at all for the outsider, Rhys-Goch from the north, with his cheeky remarks about the men of Powys. That was a word that was not fair, says Llywelyn, and it's not worth fiddlesticks, literally not worth a darning needle. Now, Rhys has to respond. And we find the subject of judgment runs all the way through his second poem. Okay? So the first question he has is, who asked you? Pwy aberys itbrish? Who asked you to to write a review of my poem? Okay? And what's more, he hadn't intended it to be judged. Okay? It's not for submission to judgment. It's an elegy for an old friend and colleague. And judgment, criticism, is just not appropriate. Ni bion prodi per awdl, ddarnad ohonof cof coeth I ferddyn Powys fawrddoedd. I was just composed a sweet rhyme, an elegy, fine material, for the very wise Merlin of Powys. So Gruffydd Llwyd. So not only was the occasion inappropriate, Rhys is not convinced that Llywelyn has any right to be judging him. Is he even fully qualified? Is he in fact profadwy? Os sgwrodd lad profadwy? So profadwy, then another derivative of that verb profi. Has he passed his exams? Is he of the status where he can be picking a fight with a senior colleague? And then Llywelyn is also judged by unfair criteria. He picked out one peculiar phrase in Rhys's poem. So ceisio coegliddio I glod gwr hen am un gair hynod. So un gair hynod, one unexpected phrase, was all that Llywelyn criticised. And it wasn't Rhys, finally, who started all this by casting around judgments in the first place. That was Llywelyn. Nid minnau a ddechreuawdd, brodiau neb rhy brydydd. But Rhys now has an answer for the bad behaviour of his junior colleague. And he makes the most of his opponent's young age. He poses as Llywelyn's examiner, and he lays down a poetic challenge for him. Explain to me, he says, the origin and nature of the awen, of poetic inspiration. Where does it come from? The answer is to be submitted to a panel of experts from Powys itself. This is a devastating put-down from a senior poet to a junior. Now, the reply of Llywelyn ap Moel to this challenge is very careful, very well worded, and he rises to the challenge, and he gives his view of the awen. And it's an amazingly interesting passage. In fact, one of the most significant passages of literary thought or doctrine that we have from medieval Wales. But it takes us away from our theme of judgment, and I can see that you would not welcome a digression at this stage in the evening. So I'll wrap up my discussion of this Ymryson, but just pointing out that what's fascinating about it
this exchange between Rhysgolchredu on the one hand and Llywelyn Aber Moel on the other, is that we have a poetic reenactment of the testing of an apprentice poet by a senior poet. The younger man has to respond to this test. He has to show both deference, but he also has to defend his own honour. It's a very public test. Failure would have been very humiliating for Llywelyn and would also have shown him up against the other poets of Powys who are doing the judging. It well illustrates what a delicate thing judgment is, and criticism. These are things that can be used to control access to authority, but also to assert one's own right to push in and claim some of that authority. Right, it's time to conclude. I've given you a brief tour of medieval literary criticism. I've taken in only one area of the Celtic literatures, which is Welsh bardic poetry, and I've only scratched the surface. There are many, many more juicy and interesting ymrysonau out there that I would have liked to cover tonight. Bardic poetry, though, gives us really good explicit evidence for criticism because it was run by a cadre of professionals, it was very public, it was very competitive, the stakes for individuals were high, and, let us be quite frank here, there were some big male egos rubbing up against one another. Okay? All of this encouraged a culture of judgment. In the words of Simon de Vychan, then, again, Tri pheth oedd ellir prydydd, iawn gani, ag iawn ddysgu, ag iawn farnu. The poet is required to do three things. He must compose correctly, teach correctly, and judge correctly. But criticism is fundamental to the reception of all literature, and it can be looked for throughout what remains of medieval texts. Much of it does not have to be made in the same kind of explicit terms as I've been exploring tonight. There are many other areas to look at, but from the things people chose to copy, to the authorities they choose to cite, to the words they use to describe other authors and text, to the changes they make in copying, and many, many other decisions that we see in our corpora. Value judgments pervade the written record, and I think the assumptions that underlie such judgments deserve much further exploration. Thank you.